Okay, yeah, so good.
Welcome everyone. Welcome to the grand final of ANU's Dev Day 2023. Congratulations to all teams. Very excited to watch this debate, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what crazy things are coming out. If there is no further ado, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the debate. He's here.
Just a warning for teams, the bells will be milk. That's going to get so tiring. Yes. Use that. I just hated that didn't know that was never the bell. It'd be very terrifying.
The case that we're going to run from OG is incredibly simple. Memories form a core part of your identity. There are lots of reasons why people want to remember certain parts of their life, but for whatever reason, because of those circumstances that occurred during that time, those things might be harder to retain over time. Those are things that are incredibly valuable to them, something that is incredibly disappointing and sad to lose, and that is something that they would prefer to have in the world in the world that we propose. Firstly, to deal with what this, to just do some setup. Firstly, what this counterfactual probably looks like is just the status quo, that you would just have a relatively normal memory. Obviously, you still potentially have some forms of vivid memories in that normal memory, but in our world, probably an abnormally large amount of those memories are particularly vivid. You remember particular parts of those memories that you don't in ordinary memories, things like sensory details, emotional complexities, and so on. I think the other thing we want to establish is that this condition is particularly agnostic to the types of memory that it makes vivid. That is to say, you probably have an equal amount of happy memories and traumatic or sad memories, depending on basically how your life has looked to this point. It doesn't emphasize particular types of memories throughout. I'm going to have basically one main substantial point, but it will have a couple of parts to it. And that is basically to say that memories form a core part of your identity, and that in this world you would prefer to know more about your own life as you progress through it, because that has a range of benefits for you. Why are memories particularly central to your identity? The first thing is that they are key experiences that shape you, whether that is an experience that happened to you while growing up, whether that is a choice that you have made or a relationship that you've had with a person that has continued to shape you in a particular, either just changed the course of your life in terms of the actions that you take, or has changed you in some emotional way that you have matured from that experience, or you have learned something about yourself or the world in some way. Those are key experiences that shape you. But I think also it is just part of your life story and your backstory. And I think a lot of humans, the way that we form our identities is by telling a story about ourselves in the past tense, because those are the things that inform who we are now. They explain what our personality is, what our identity is, and that is the way that we try to understand what our identities are, generally just the layman's person who doesn't study extreme philosophy about identity and so on, which I certainly do not. Why are there certain things that you want to remember super clearly, but that you might not be able to do? The first thing is that memories don't capture every single part of an experience that you might necessarily want them to have. For example, there are specific sensory experiences that memories degrade quite quickly. For example, it's much harder to remember a particular smell that you experienced when you were somewhere, or the sound of a person's voice if you haven't heard it for a particularly long amount of time. Those degrade over time much more quickly. But I think also it is important to note that emotions and the complexity of what an emotion feels like in a specific moment is likely to be something that simplifies over time. As you look back in hindsight, hindsight and think, oh, rather than like, oh, I was really sad about that or really happy about that, whereas in the moment that you're experiencing it and you knew all of the facts about that situation, you potentially felt more like in a more emotionally complex way, and that's probably something that again degrades quite quickly with time. The second reason why there are probably things that you don't remember as well is because you just accumulate a large amount of memories over your life, and those are things that you are probably like, some of them end up, especially your early memories, which are particularly critical in shaping your identity, are the things that degrade first, and when you have many more memories, some are things you are likely to forget. The third reason is that, and I think this is particularly important for this debate, is that there are often circumstances in your life that means that it's harder to remember particular events that might end up being particularly crucial for you wanting to remember. And I think that those are, for example, things where particular circumstances, like you having a bunch of preoccupations on your time or your energy or your stress, that you don't remember a particular experience. For example, if you are raising a child, like, as a new parent, that is something that's incredibly stressful, probably where you're extremely sleep deprived and don't remember every single aspect of that moment, even though in hindsight, that's probably something you do want to remember in a great amount of detail. You want to remember what their first word and steps were. Obviously, you probably remember them anyway, but you probably want to remember the more day-to-day quotidian moments, because that was what it was like to raise that child, to know who they came to be as a person. That's probably very important to you. There are other reasons why you would forget these memories degrade as well. For example, that you might have experienced extreme intensity of emotion at that time because you were grieving someone and you forgot certain parts of that event. Or, for example, mental illness often has a distorting effect on memories. It means that it is harder to remember certain parts when you're experiencing a particularly intense moment of that mental illness. So I think that this is to say that there are a lot of reasons why you would want to remember certain things, but that is out of your control, that you would be able to lose them. Why is it likely to be good for you and something that you would want to have these memories back? Because you remember those crucial moments that were extremely important to you, and probably are even more important in hindsight. For example, like raising your child, when you can look back on them now, knowing them as a grown adult, and remember them in all of their complexity. And I think also, quite importantly, for someone who is processing grief, when you don't remember the moment of that traumatic event happening, for example, that is something that's going to be incredibly important. I'm going to talk, basically preempt why trauma is actually not particularly important in this debate, but before opposition says it. But before that, I'll take one from closing if they have one.
Our brain's pretty advanced. It's adapted for a long time. Why wouldn't it do a good job of picking out which memories to forget?
Because you don't really have control over your brain over what, picking out what its memories are. Brains do things in a very idiosyncratic way, in a way that you can't control. You might want to remember something very particular, but you can't because that is because your brain has either said that, oh, you were too sleep deprived, too tired, because you were experiencing an intense moment in your life. You don't have any control over that. You probably want to have control over that, and that's what this motion gives you. Going to preempt the trauma stuff. First of all, this is the first thing to note is that this is agnostic to the type of memories that you have. That is, you are likely to have equal amounts of happy, vivid memories and happy and vivid traumatic, vivid sad memories, I guess. But I think it's important to note that in the world at the moment, you probably remember your traumatic memories slightly more vividly because they are traumatic and they are things that occur. Things that you remember them because they're traumatic. So therefore, this is likely probably to be symmetric. But I think the second more important piece of reasoning here is that when you are processing trauma, it's not about you forgetting the memory of what happened to you. It's about processing how that memory makes you feel, how you interact with the emotions that you experience when you think about it, and how to develop a better emotional response to that in a way that is more constructive to you than destructive. So I think that actually the vividness in this case doesn't make those traumatic memories particularly worse. In fact, potentially it could be better for you to explain those and be able to talk about those in a better way with a therapist who means you're better equipped to explain those sorts of things to them, which makes it easier for you. So I think this is actually probably something that gets better under our side. What is the way in for this in terms of making it you having a better identity? Firstly, if you feeling like you can lose something that is a core part of your identity is an incredibly sad and disappointing experience when you know that is something that's crucial to your life and knowing that you could lose it. Secondly, secondly, I think it just makes you better able to self-advocate for yourself when you can remember you doing a bad action in a certain time and knowing how to improve that choice and make it better the next time. This is a core part of your identity. That is something that we were very proud to keep and to want to retain throughout the rest of your life. Very proud to propose.
Thank you so much to the Prime Minister for their fine remarks, and I welcome the Leader of the Opposition to continue this debate.
opposition's model fell down when they firstly assumed that people have both equally positive and negative memories, and secondly, that these people can somehow outweigh and outbalance these positive memories from the negative ones. Three major things in this speech. Firstly, setup. Secondly, why under our side why bad memories are likely to win out against the positive ones. And secondly, how this changes people's actions for the worse. So under setup, the first most important question, like who is this house that the topic is asking for? So firstly, we think it's important to note here that human experiences are varied, and you can't really like assume that there is like one general or average person who this would apply to. Secondly, we think that like the majority of human experiences are probably more negative than they are positive, unlike what the opposition claimed. So we think that this is because of a couple of reasons. Firstly, the majority of the world lives in the global south, in which there is like a really poor standards of health, like education, often cycles of poverty, and like a lack of regulations. And all of these things mean that there is like often a really poor quality of life and a lot of like poor memories that are associated with that. Thirdly, we think that there is just like, both in the global south and global north, there is just a general prevalence of violence, whether this is in like war-prone areas or like violence against women, which affects more than half the population. We think that like violence is pretty, ubiquitous across the world. And like thinking about like gun violence in like certain communities in the US, like there is like violence in the world in general. And we also think that like the emotional, there's like not only like physical pain but also emotional pain. So this is like starts from as young as when you're a kid, like if it's the death of a pet, the death of a family member, like all of these things constitute negative experiences. And finally, we think that like even the most privileged people in the world, like their experiences like it's like probably like an office job or whatever, like being at 9 to 5, and we think that like these people don't necessarily need to like relive their like Zoom meetings and that kind of thing. So no thank you. This all means that the ability to have a life that is more good than bad, for those who have the privilege of living a life that is more good than bad, these people often already have access to resources such as money, which can block out these bad memories or like reduce them or in some cases eradicate them and deal with this problem. So the second point to note under setup is that like you don't get to choose which memories you do relive, like the opposition tried to tell you. And thirdly, we think that like who is impacted the most under this model is those with poor experiences, like we characterize, those who have experienced trauma, because under this model, they will like experience a really large-scale harm as opposed to the people who generally have a positive quality of life. The scale of harm is like much less towards them because they largely already have a good life, so this model wouldn't affect them as much. So onto the first point, like why are bad memories more likely to win out against positive ones? So there are a couple of reasons of this. Firstly, like as we've established, the like sheer quantity of poor memories or negative memories like is more likely to outweigh those that are positive. Secondly, even if you don't believe this, we think that the intensity of negative experiences tend to be a lot higher than those that are positive. So like the opposition tried to give you the example of like the stress of raising a child, but we think that like the visceral, like kind of physical stress that's like is likely to color that memory and therefore like pervade it. And we think that like good memories tend to be like purely emotional, whereas bad ones can be both physical and emotional. And this is something really important that we need to know. And thirdly, we think that like humans already in the status quo cope by like blocking things out and reducing the scale or the intensity of these memories. And this is because they're protected from thinking about it constantly. They're protected from this. And fourthly, we think that like engaging in therapy in the status quo allows like people to heal and move on. And we think that under this model, when you have repeated exposure of these harmful, like negative memories to these people, this is really damaging. I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah. Would you say that life isn't worth living if you're born in the global south?
No. No, obviously not. But we think that under the model that they are given, like these people's quality of life is likely to be much more reduced because any like negative memories that they have, they will be reliving over and over again, which are likely to outweigh the positive ones. And so we think that like we're saying that it's not just possible for people who experience bad things to be happy, but like the visceral feelings that are attached to these memories are likely mean that the bad memories are really, really bad. And so this means that the people who experience this, their quality of life is like suffered drastically, and this is why we should care about this. Onto the second point, being like how people's actions will change for the worse under the opposition's model. So we think that like when you are constantly reminded of bad things, you are less likely to take risks. So for example, this can like the risk, for example, like the risk of rejection and the risk of failure is like a really negative thing that like deters people from acting in these ways. And under the model, when you are constantly reliving like negative memories, which often like stem from like failure or rejection, in the status quo, the memory of these changes their risk calculus and like reduces their like memory of this over time. And like these risks kind of become the long-term harm rather than the status quo when they're sort of a short-term thing but like for a long-term gain. Under the oppositions model, the risk, because it's like constantly in your mind, it becomes a long-term harm rather than a short-term one. So secondly, the second thing to note here is that we think that the most positive experiences in life have some sort of risk attached to it. So for example, like if you are afraid to love people because they will die, like these kind of things, like even getting a job, getting into a relationship, like often high reward comes with high risk, and the majority of positive things have like some sort of risk attached to them. So therefore, like we think that the majority of these people are less likely to undertake these risky behaviors, and if they're less likely to take risks because of like fear of rejection and failure under having this condition, we think that they are less likely to gain these positive experiences, less likely to have a better quality of life, and less likely to have meaningful relationships with the people around them. So because we think that like these bad memories will win out against any positive ones they have, and secondly like change these people's behavior for the worse, we think that this is like a really, really harmful proposition, and that is why we are so, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the leader of the opposition for their final remarks. And I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government badge. Yeah.
So the way I'm going to structure this speech is by going through what we've heard from opposition and linking it back into our case and demonstrating how basically their entire case kind of revolves around the fact that life sucks, we don't want to remember these things, and that's kind of the facts of the matter. And I think what I really want to do is show you how even the most, even if you are living in pretty squalid conditions, your life is still worth living. So let's look at like their setup, right? So what we hear is that, well, human experiences are varied, but majority of experiences are negative. And we hear this like very, very visceral sort of description of what this world is like a really traumatic place to live in, where, you know, even the most privileged people, you know, hate their lives, or not even hate, that is probably a strong word, but they just, you know, have more negative than positive emotions. And I think this is wildly unfair. Though I will touch on the importance of negative emotions, I think it's too important. So consider like someone working a 9-to-5 job that's a tad tedious. Say they come home and they hear that, you know, maybe their kids are home from school and they're laughing as they're running down the door. That's something you want to remember. Like in 50 years, that memory of like, I don't know, your plants on a desk and seeing the like sun cascade and you've got like a lovely shadow. Like all these little memories that I think are so important and actually are what add value to your life. And I think the idea that our lives are, you know, mostly boring, or even in like the most, you know, people living in the worst conditions. I mean, like, I remember, you know, reading, you know, diary entries of like people living in trenches in like World War II, right? But they still have like lives worth living despite all that. Like, there's a reason we keep living, right? And so I think that just the whole fact that their speech relies on the metric that like life is mostly kind of awful, or like most of your memories are negative, kind of just feels like a very sad way to look at this, and I think is where their speech falls flat. So that's on their like setup. But now too, again, back onto like the bad win out when we consider the sheer quantity of bad memories. And like, again, I kind of want to raise what we brought up at opening, is that like we did mention that like the intensity of like the way you remember these memories is like, it's an agnostic sort of disease to say. And I think that like, even if it's not, I think we can mitigate this by the fact that you are remembering like not just sad memories, you are remembering like the most wonderful memories, or like really lovely memories, like whether that's like a loved one who's just passed away and you can remember so many like little parts about them. Like, and I think again, it's important to note here that not every bad memory is not, like the way this works isn't like a PTSD thing that you are constantly walking through life just remembering like every single bad thing that happened to you. Like, of course PTSD may play a role if you do go through, like that becomes a part of your life, but to some extent it's like you just remember things in more detail when you want to recall them. And of course sometimes things can be triggered, and like that's a very valid like part of your like mental makeup. But I think it's a bit unfair to be like you are now just walking through life filled with like really awful memories. I will take a POI now if opposition has one. Okay, so moving on to the sort of third main metric that I really want to look at today is that like, okay, well, it changes actions for the worse. And I just wanted to highlight, to start off with, like a bit of it, some incongruent logic. So they're like, okay, they said that you're going to associate risk with bad things, right? So you're going to have you're going to be adverse to risk. You're not going to do risk because, like, I don't know, you might be in a relationship and he cheats on you and then you never want to love again, right? And like, but then they also kind of touched on this whole thing of like, well, good memories are risk. Like a lot of your memories are associated with risk. And I just found that this was a very incongruent way to establish that, because I think risk is like, there's a reason it's risky, because sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. And I don't think that that is as powerful as they thought it was in that scenario. Additionally, I think I really want to touch on the fact that negative memories can be good. Sometimes it's good, like, okay, when you're younger and you're like, say your parent is like cooking eggs, right? You're not gonna go, like you might, when you're younger, touch the pan and then go, ow, that hurts. And then you know in future not to touch that pan, right? Because it's like hot and you will burn your fingers. And I think that's a very basic anecdote, but it's kind of like this idea that if you can remember bad memories, you remember like awful experiences, that is such a good chance for growth. Like think of the amount of lessons and amount of memories that you can like learn from all of that like rhetoric, and the fact that this is then amplified even more. Like that is just such a useful like, I guess, mechanism to add to your life. Yes, I'll take you.
When's the last time you burnt your hand on a pen?
It was actually last night. I was and it wasn't on a pan, but the boiling water fell on my hand because I broke the cup. Anyway, moving on. So I've learnt from that scenario, for example, not to pour tea into a cracked cup. So sometimes, of course, we should avoid risk, but I think that's where negative memories can be helpful, but I also think that there's a reason it is risk, because it's 50-50, right? Well, depending on the risk. So also, I want to touch more on what like Niamh finished at the end of her speech, and that is like, and kind of what I've been looking at here, and that's like the importance that memories can give you, that like self-understanding that can really just improve your life, right? So if you can like remember such wonderful things about your life, like whatever brings you joy, and you're not like, it's hard because you have that vivid memory, then in like, as you live your life, maybe like rose-tinted glasses or things that make things maybe seem worse aren't as powerful because you've got such like memory skills, right? So basically you're able to like more critically analyze past decisions for good, for worse, whether they cause you stress, like any kind of along those lines. And like, I don't think we can like diminish the impact that this has on your life, because like literally memories are the foundation of your experience, of your life, like of how you act. Like you act because of a memory of when you were younger, but that is like, they're the foundation of your identity. And so to remember more and to remember it more vividly, if that is how we learn as like people and how we develop like emotionally and mentally, I just don't think we can like diminish the power of that. And onto their like onto trauma, I think obviously like I need to touch on this slightly, but I think again what Niamh says about trauma, that therapy, like, you know, if you are trying to process trauma, right? I think what's really important to note here is that therapy is not about forgetting, right? It's about processing and dealing with experiences in a healthier manner. So even if, say, you do remember like some traumatic experiences with a significant amount of detail, of course, and that is going to be very hard and maybe make it more difficult, but if you can then learn to process those more effectively, that will make, like, you could argue in the long term, a better, more well-rounded human being. And I think that links back again to like being able to remember bad memories, good memories, and just like growing as a person to a more effective ability, which I think is really powerful. So thank you.
Thank you so much to the Deputy Prime Minister for their fine remarks, and I now welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude our opening half.
I am probably one of the most privileged people in the world. If I had to think through every detail of every most humiliating moment in my life in visceral detail and experience the emotions that I experienced then, that would probably significantly impact my ability to actually be able to use that privilege to enjoy my life in many other ways, because it would likely consume me. The argument that we make that the majority of human experiences for people who are outside of this privilege are negative is not to suggest those people's lives are not worth living. It suggests their lives are worth living in the status quo because they are able to use the natural way their brains don't remember everything perfectly to move past those negative experiences to continue to make positive experiences and to be able to access those positive emotions. If you remembered all of those negative experiences that we prove outnumber the positive ones in numerical terms, you are going to be less likely to be able to positively access things that would make your life better. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, prove why the stuff that they tell you about why accessing positive memories in this vivid manner is just not important. And secondly, then explain why the negative impacts of accessing your negative memories in this manner would be much, much worse. So firstly, in terms of the positive memories, the first thing that I would say is it's just important to know that you can know knowledge about yourself and know reasons why you are the way you are and why your personality is the way it is without needing to viscerally or vividly remembering those experiences in and of themselves. So for example, I can remember how a bad relationship has impacted me and I can understand the links to therefore how I am today. I do not want to feel myself being in that situation again and feel the emotions associated with that again. That provides me no extra value over that. Similarly, I remember burning myself on an iron. I have now learnt the lesson of not to touch an iron when it is hot. But I don't remember the feeling of that, and nor do I need to, because that would just add unnecessary negative impact to my life and make me kind of experience pain sometimes that I didn't have to feel. Secondly, many things that you forget in the status quo for reasons that they give you because of things like stress or pressure actually would likely come through in the vivid detail they talk to you about and probably mean that some positive memories that you have in the status quo are actually overshadowed by that vivid detail. So for example, if you struggle to remember every aspect of raising your child because you're particularly sleep deprived or stressed, a lot of that stress and sleep deprivation would come through in your memories, and you'd likely remembering a lot of things like being angry at your child for waking you up by crying when you were trying to get a 3rd hour of sleep for the 10th night in a row. It's probably better that you look at a lot of those experiences with people you love through rose-colored glasses so you don't feel resentment towards them and you actually remember the positive memories there as well. So a lot of your reasons for forgetting those things that you may want to remember probably means that you just actually don't want to remember them in vivid detail, you want to remember the general idea of them. And we think people like to kind of fill the gaps of their memory in ways that make them happy in these circumstances because they want to think about those positively. And people can have vivid imaginations about what this looked like. That's probably preferable to having vivid memories of what it actually looked like at the time. Finally, what we tell you at Kate is incredibly important, which does just change your risk calculus for what you're willing to take on for the rest of your life. I'm going to explain in a couple of minutes why these negative memories are likely to outweigh the positive memories in terms of the impact have here. I think that's incredibly important because I just think you stop doing things that potentially could lead to that negative outcome because you're scared that that overwhelming negative experience is going to be worse than the potential positive experience you can have from it, right? Like necessarily, if you want to get something like love, that comes at the cost of A, potentially rejection in the first place, and of every single moment that you do love someone, and then at the end they just die, and that's also a negative experience, right? There are so many different things that can be really bad for. Second, like even if you know things like good jobs, that also comes at the cost of rejection. Striving for academic success comes with the potential possibility of failure. All those things mean that people are less likely to go for them at the point at which they think that negative experience is going to be overwhelming, but I'll explain the kind of mechanization about that now. But at the end of this, right, the things that
want to remember right now, they do remember. They perhaps don't remember in this vivid emotional detail, but they can make that stuff up in the status quo, right? They can feel vividly that they are happy that something occurred. They can use their imagination to fill in the gaps. They don't need to fill in the memories for the specifics. Secondly, on negative things and why that's really important, closing's POI to Kate is just a little bit silly because life is absolutely worth living in the global south right now because you are able to undermine those negative things by forgetting that they've happened sometimes or not remembering them to the fullest extent that they happened, not feeling the physical and emotional memories to the potential vivid degree that they occurred at the time, which means you can make memories with your families and you can make the best of the situation that you have. The point at which, though, you have to remember these things in vivid detail, we say that your quality of life gets significantly worse. Closing, do you want to go again? Cool, okay, I'll continue. Look, Kate gives you a list of really bad things that exist in the status quo, like things that do just genuinely exist in the majority of the world, things like poverty, things like violence. I will obviously not go into explaining the vivid detail of these things, but you have to remember that people who have these memories and who have the majority of their lives experienced as being things like poverty and maybe violence and maybe sexual violence in some instances are remembering it vividly because that is what this topic says. So you can kind of, do the imagination work yourself there if you have to, but it's a pretty negative impact there. That's why it's really bad that OG said that this is going to be agnostic towards whether or not you take, agnostic towards what sort of memories that you get. Because we do the mechanization about why the majority of those memories are likely to be bad. They never do the mechanistic work to suggest that, actually you have good things. They say, well, the good things outweigh the bad. But we explain that only exists in the status quo because your memory is imperfect and you can forget that some of those bad things occur. Sometimes as well, you just have to remember you just don't always control your memory. So it is true that you can choose what you want to remember at certain moments, but you don't always get to choose that. Sometimes things just pop up in your head. So you are likely to have those negative memories show up as well. Secondly, as we point out, remembering trauma has occurred is just very different to reliving that trauma as well. So again, we can kind of access the benefit of opening government by saying that you remember that something has happened, but they also then have to say that you also have to re-experience this. This is very important because, as we explained to you at Kate, a lot of negative trauma tends to combine both an emotional impact on you and also a physical impact, right? So they talk about remembering sensory details. Remembering the sensory details of violence is particularly unpleasant. In comparison, a lot of those positive memories are just things that are less sensory in general, like they're about how you feel, but often you don't get a huge amount of joy by feeling particularly physical gains, right? Which means that we think the impact of those memories that are negative tends to be overwhelming in comparison to the impact of those memories are positive. So even if you did have equal good and bad memories viscerally, which we tell you is unlikely mechanistically to be the case, you're likely to be overwhelmed by those bad memories in these instances. Thirdly, it stops your brain's ability to protect itself, as it does in the status quo, by getting rid of some of those memories that when you are particularly stressed or in a particularly bad situation. Fourthly, they tell you it's not about having this memory in the first place, right? They say it's not about forgetting, it's about how you remember. But they explain to you pretty much themselves about why they ruin the ability for therapy to do its job with people, right? Because to the extent that people cannot just have a different response to the stimulus every time they occur, because the memory is equally vivid each time, and they can never just exposure therapy themselves away from that vividness, people are likely to have the same negative reaction to those experiences each individual time, which means that it just takes way longer for people to get over bad emotions and bad experiences in the first place because they just have to keep living them again and again. They can never just have a different approach to them because the experience is incredibly unpleasant both times. In the status quo, people get the opportunity to overlook the negatives or the brains do their work for them. That is how they can make positive memories even out of bad situations. Government side never allows them to do that, so proud to oppose.
Thank you so much to
The intuition on which this CO extension starts is simply to ask what makes almost every individual in the world the most happy. It is the interactions and the love and relationships they form with others. I don't just mean romantic, I mean everyday interactions. I mean, sadly, even the interactions I have with people. And the question then is, which side is most likely to improve that? And it is the way in which CO is going to win in this case. The first part of this extension, though, is to answer a bizarre question the government has, which is what happens if I forget things? Because actually the first part of this argument is going to explain why it is good not that we forget trauma, but it is in fact good that we forget good things. Because it is good to attempt to actively remember those things. Because we posit that memories you forget are not truly lost. Like the electrons in your brain have not disappeared into the ether, because that's not how conservation of mass and energy works. Literally just winning Dhruv there. But the premise here is that being prompted with information and examples, again, allows you to re-remember those things. When you see a photo of sending your kid off to school in the morning, you remember what that morning was like. When you visit your childhood home, you remember the experiences you had running up those stairs, running towards the area of that house that had like the Christmas tree in it or whatever. We think those actions are specifically cathartic and specifically enjoyable. Asking your partner of 40 years, what was our first date like? Do you remember our first kiss? And then being able to answer with something you have forgotten. You relive that in a way that's specifically unique and joyful. But the most important part of this argument is it gives you choice. It gives you the ability to remember those things on your own terms and only and when you wish to remember them or not. I think that is what is missing from the gov bench. They think there is no choice. I think take a photo, talk to your wife. The second part of this extension will explain why additional memories is actively bad for your interpersonal relationships and why that is the most certain occurrence to happen in this day. Because I think obviously Olo is correct, trauma is terrible and you probably shouldn't relive the vividness of that. And they're probably correct that a fair amount of people have trauma in the world, but not everyone does. Which means our claim is this is a far more certain outcome. The first thing we're going to explain is that this ability to remember everything eventually just means you're likely to be bullied at school. And this is for the very basic reason that like bullies are assholes and they bully anyone that's slightly different. But more importantly, like you're probably like signaling a set of things that are seen as kind of freakish, right? Like you're seen as remembering everything, remembering specific details, or just like the simple thing of remembering something the teacher said and upshowing the bully. That is likely to mean you're bullied. Remember that trauma. But more importantly, and I think the much better mechanism to this argument, is the expectations you have and the individuals around you have around remembering things are drastically different. And that is likely to build resentment in very problematic ways. And I really want to point out here, this argument is basically just me comparing myself to the fact that I have bad memory, which obviously creates the same differences in memories this debate would occur. The first thing is it says you're likely to forget important things like appointments. And I think our opening talks about those things as being important, but obviously the person that is likely to organize that appointment for you or also has to go to that appointment does forget it. And it means either you are angry that that person has forgotten the important appointment, that person isn't prepared, makes you late or something like that, the small amounts of resentments that are continually going to occur, or it requires you to be the one that in every situation takes on the emotional labor that is required to remember those things, remind your partner, your friends and family you're required to do those things. The second thing is just to ask, is this empathetic gap likely to be closed by, as CG says, just kind of like adapting to the situation? I think there's reasons why this empathy gap is not likely to close. The first thing is, it's incredibly hard for you, someone who's always been born this way and behaved this way, and understand or believe you understand that the memory does behave in this way. In the same way someone like myself does not understand the experience of a black person. In the same way that someone who's not trans does not understand that experience, that empathy gap can only be bridged so far, and we expect this one cannot be either. The second is that these people, even if they understand in the knowledge sense that there is a difference in their understandings with others, it's very hard for them not to understand how easy or hard it is to do the actions that are required to bridge that gap. Because of course, if you forget something, you should probably write something down, which obviously is a rebuttal to the gov bench. But the problem is, those things are kind of hard and actually do require a bit of emotional labor and remembering, which is ironically you need to remember the remembering list. But of course, the problem there is you as the person who lives with that person, who loves them, and remembers those things without having to write a list, does not understand the differences and the difficulties in remember themselves to do that list. That builds resentment as you forget things, as you don't understand, as you insist. Why do you just not remember the important things in our life? Why do you not look after me? Why do you make me do the emotional labor? That is an almost certain outcome, as this person surely ends up in a relationship, ends up finding love, at least has family and friends. The final, two other claims about why this is likely to lead to poor interpersonal relationships. Before that, appeal line.
If you know that your partner doesn't have HSAM, why would you be blaming them for not having HSAM?
Because you can't resolve the empathy gap. Did you sorry buddy, did you listen to a minute of my speech? Like, obviously this is like the hyper-logical, like rational actor thing you should do. People are not this. Empathy gaps are hard to close. They are emotional people. These things are hard to deal with. Second, the third mechanism, rather, why you are likely to hold grudges. And that is because when you don't understand, when you remember the viscerality of a moment, it does not matter how much that hurts you, which is what our opening relies upon, but how much that you remember the viscerality of it, which means it's always unacceptable to you. And the problem here is you remind other people of grudges and shame them, reference to a previous debate, when they don't uphold that grudge anymore and in fact just kind of move on. They don't allow you to kind of talk to that person and rely on them as a support network because you continue to hold that grudge and you can remember when you go to ask them for help, you remember the time they broke down on you last time, the way that they broke down your trust. And of course, trust is so important in these contexts. You can't have a relationship, you can't have friendships without believing that person will act in your best interest. Which means all you need to do genuinely for this person to maintain friendships, they need to find people that never betray their trust. And unfortunately, humans are humans and fuck up and make these mistakes. Which means those interpersonal situations mean you just have less people to refer to as a support network. You have less people to deal with the trauma that our opening proves you have to deal with. In our world, we prove you don't have the support networks to be able to deal with that trauma. Which means, in the extension that occurs, which I don't think does happen all the time, but when it does, we are the team that provides the meta mechanism to explain that, or explain why it is hard to process that situation, because you don't reach out to the therapist because no friend tells you to, because you don't trust them, because they don't look after you, because you remember the one time they fucked you over. I think it is certain this person will have to deal with friends and family, and hopefully they fall in love. And if they do, that experience will be worse than you and I feel deeply sorry for that person. Very proud to oppose.
Hey, go back.
Oh! Where are the safety slides?
It was loaded before I added the safety slides.
Lucky you didn't go one further.
The animation saved me.
Yeah, that did.
Ready? Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I spent 7 years of my early life living in Perth. When I returned to Perth occasionally to see my family and I walk through the doors of my childhood home to visit it again, I smell the smell of my floorboards. My entire lifetime of those 7 years of memories come rushing back to me. They come rushing back to me to the extent that I can think about where I am now in my life and how that relates to my life at that time. It not only gives me the euphoric feeling of remembering something that I thought I had lost, but it also recontextualizes those memories and provides me with a new experience of development relating to them. This was a crucial thing that we provided in this debate. We gave you the ability and we explained why it was important to remember things that you once thought were lost. This was something that was not explained at opening. We thought this was a unique and important contribution. And note here how this extends their burden, right? Because what opening explained, they explained why it is always good to remember good memories and why it is it's always bad to remember bad memories and it can be good to remember good memories. But what we explained is that there is sometimes a value in forgetting those good memories and then rediscovering. This was unique, this was extending on their burden, and this was incredibly important in this debate. Dealing with CG's contribution first. They tell us 4 things here. Firstly, they tell us abnormally large does not equal perfect memory. I'm going to deal with this later when I deal with OG. Secondly, they tell us that life is good and inherently sacred. This is just not the counterfaction in this debate. Disregard this. Thirdly, they tell us that it can be important because it furthers your career by being able to remember things like numbers and stats. You can pick a career and do super well in it. Firstly, just note this is potentially outside the topic in terms of remembering your life experiences. But the much more important thing here is that no matter how successful your career is or how much money you make, this matters completely nothing in this debate if you are completely alienated from your friends and family, if you cannot relate to them in the same way, if you cannot form meaningful relationships. We do not give a shit how much money you have. If you do not have friends, if you do not have family that you can talk to, we think that your life is significantly worse off. We've explained this very well to no response at opposing whip. The last thing they tell us here is that your older life improves significantly. We think, firstly, that like an older person now is able to remember a lot of these significant experiences. It's very unclear why an 80-year-old does not remember their first kiss. A lot of the formative experiences that they rest their case on getting value from are things that the brain is adapted to remember because we remember what is important to us. Under the status quo, it is very unclear why our memories are so shit as the opposition likes to characterize them. The last thing they tell us here is their only response to our extension, which is to say that people are socialized with HSAM, therefore they're able to function in life. In the inflow side, it states that this disease is incredibly rare. This means that firstly, there is probably not a massive understanding of how it works, how it affects your ways to socialize with the world. This means that you are probably less able to engage with things like therapy. You are less able to get help or to get like general understanding from people around you of the condition and how it affects you. And secondly, it meant that you're likely to grow up around nobody else that had this condition. This meant that you're even more likely to feel alienated, on top of the things like bullying, on top of the isolation because people do not understand you in the same way, because you cannot relate to them in the same way. We thought that this alienation was therefore actually enhanced through what the opposition brings up around socialization. So we think we pretty clearly beat them on a lot of metrics there. So what do we get from our opening in this debate? We think we beat them in a number of ways. We mainly do this by explaining more universal benefits. We would note here how their response to the opposition bench or to the government bench kind of enhances this right, because the difference in how often you believe trauma happens or how severely it affects an individual is the width by which we are able to win this clash, because we explain to you that regardless of whether trauma has happened to you in life, this disease would affect how you relate to other people. We explain why this was so important and so harmful, and that even if you didn't have significant trauma, which made your like everyday life significantly harder to remember, your life was going to potentially be a living hell anyway, because you were living through it alone with nobody that you could like emotionally invest in, nobody that was on an equal footing with you. And so clearly we explain a much more universal harm than they do. The second thing we do is we explain much better than like their mechanism of risk avoidance, how you are able to jeopardize your future good experiences through the mechanism of like grudges and these interpersonal relationships. That is to say that like rather than thinking, oh, what if this relationship ends badly? This will be terrible. If the process of the relationship itself is hell, we think that this is actually probably a much more significant harm. And we think that also the unwillingness to engage with other people around you because of a thing that they did when you were a small child, but you still remembered it, you still felt the deep emotional pain of how they had wronged you, meant that you were less likely to engage with them, that your relationship stayed stagnant, and that you were not able to get a meaningful connection. You're not able to extend that. And we thought that this was a much clearer and much better explained way in which we jeopardize future good experiences rather than just that mechanism of like people will think, what if something goes wrong? We think we do this much better. We also think we explain why there's actually a significantly increased harm because of the fact that you don't get support. Because when you are alienated, when you don't trust your mother because of something that she like lied to you about severely as a child, for example, and you like continue that grudge over into your later life to the extent that you might not hate your parents because this is probably unrealistic, but you're probably not going to emotionally invest in them because you don't trust them the same way as you would still under the status quo. You don't trust that someone can relate to you on the same level, and you have been alienated for a significant amount of life. You're less likely to be able to believe that they can relate to your experiences. This means that when you're going through that daily pain of recalling grief or recalling bad experiences, as opposition says, we explain to you how actually the harm is significantly worse because you have no one that you can invest in. You have no one that you can talk to about the insane situation that you are in. And we think that this would compound those harms on top of what opposition has already explained in terms, on top of what opening has already explained on how this gets so much worse. So lastly, dealing with opening government. We think that they give us material, sure, I'll take that.
Most people can't return to their childhood homes or talk to their parents because they've passed on or are no longer part of their lives. Wouldn't it be better to have these memories independently so you can always access them?
The one thing that I would note about this is that having all of these memories continuously accessible also probably means that they don't stand out, and that when you have ways in which you can relate to your childhood, which by the way are probably not access prohibited because you can do things like look at an old photo, you can do things like read an old journal, so this probably you can access this anyway, but these are things that actually when you see them, you are able to remember them and you are able to remember their specific significance in that moment, rather than weighing it against every other single moment of your life that you remember in equal detail. The main thing that we get over opening government here is simply the fact that they assume that the brain is not well adapted to the present, and therefore they access all these great memories that you didn't previously have. But we think that the brain is actually a pretty advanced thing. Humans are actually pretty smart, and that what is important to us and the formative experiences of our lives are things that we already remember. So all of that material about how these memories form identity, for example, are simply ruined by the scientific fact that the brain is able to remember what is important to it, and that your identity is probably defined by what you do remember, not by what you could hypothetically remember if you had a photographic memory. For these reasons, we would emphasize to please remember the fact that your life would be ruined otherwise. You cannot relate to the people around you. And we think for these reasons, it is clear that you should vote closing government. Thank you.